On April 10, 2008, at approximately 3:45 p.m., United States Navy officer Captain Chris Short arrived at his home on Biltmore Drive in Portsmouth, Virginia. Chris, recently transferred from Guantanamo Bay to the Portsmouth Naval Medical Center, had been living in the area with his wife Angela and 3 adopted children, Elizabeth, Corey, and Megan Landowski. When Chris parked in the driveway, he noticed the front door to the home was slightly ajar. This detail immediately raised concern. The door was typically kept locked, especially with Megan, the couple's 16-year-old daughter, home from school in the early afternoon hours. Chris entered the house and called out for Megan, receiving no reply. As he moved toward the kitchen, he noticed blood on the floor leading out from the hallway. Within seconds, he discovered Megan lying motionless in the center of the kitchen, surrounded by a significant amount of blood. The victim, later confirmed to be Megan Landowski, had been partially undressed. Her arms had been restrained with clear packing tape, and a strip of the same tape covered her mouth. Her body bore multiple stab wounds, including injuries to the neck, chest, and upper back. Chris Short immediately dialed 911. Emergency services responded quickly, and law enforcement arrived within minutes. Detective Duck Funkhauser, one of the first officers on the scene, entered the residence and began a preliminary assessment of the crime scene. His initial observations noted visible trauma and significant blood evidence. The state of the scene indicated a prolonged and violent struggle. The knife used in the attack appeared to have been taken from the family's own kitchen, as an empty slot was noticed in the knife block. The suspected murder weapon was later located in the sink. A forensic team was dispatched to the residence. During a detailed search of the second floor, investigators found further evidence in Megan's bedroom. The bed was in disarray, consistent with a physical altercation. Under the frame of the bed, officers recovered a tape dispenser that matched the material used to bind Megan's wrists and mouth. Forensic testing revealed the presence of semen on both the bedding and the victim's clothing. The extreme nature of the wounds suggested the killer had acted with deep rage and intent to kill, rather than to simply incapacitate. The tape used to silence Megan and restrain her was wrapped tightly, further indicating premeditation and control. Investigators noted no clear sign of forced entry at the front or back doors. However, examination of a ground-level window revealed it had been left unlatched, and there were scuff marks on the sill and disturbed mulch beneath it. This evidence supported the theory that the perpetrator entered the home through the window and exited the same way. The Shorts had no home security system or cameras at the time, and neighbors reported seeing nothing out of the ordinary. The surrounding properties were typical of suburban military housing, well kept, with fences and small yards, but spaced far enough apart that a quiet entry and exit would not have been easily noticed during daylight. As investigators continued to document the scene and collect evidence, the immediate priority became identifying potential suspects. The brutal nature of the attack, the use of a kitchen knife from the victim's home, and the personal violation suggested that the killer either knew Megan or had closely studied her routine. It was determined that Megan had last been seen at school that morning. Her mother, Angela Short, had dropped her off, and Megan was expected to return home by 2:45 p.m. There were no known plans for visitors. In the hours following the discovery of Megan's body, the Portsmouth Police Department initiated a full-scale homicide investigation. Detectives established a working theory. The suspect entered the home through the window, assaulted Megan in her bedroom, and moved her to the kitchen either during or after the attack. The use of tape, the location of the wounds, and the lack of theft or vandalism strongly pointed to a sexual assault-driven homicide, with anger and control at the center of the motive. With no eyewitnesses, no immediate suspects, and only forensic evidence to build from, the case would rely heavily on DNA analysis, interviews with people close to Megan, and careful reconstruction of her last known movements. In the days following Megan Landowski's murder, investigators at the Portsmouth Police Department began compiling a list of individuals with known access to the victim or possible motives for violence. One of the first names raised was Keith Kemp, a man who had been a close personal friend of Megan's stepfather, Chris Short. The connection between Kemp and the family was well established. He had been a frequent guest in their home and was known to the children. However, 5 months prior to Megan's death, a criminal report had drastically altered that relationship. In late 2007, Megan disclosed to her parents that Kemp had behaved inappropriately toward her. The allegations included non-consensual physical contact. Chris Short, upon learning of the accusations, immediately brought Megan to the Portsmouth Police Department to file a report. During her interview with lead investigator Robert McDaniel, Megan detailed a pattern of escalating behavior. She also expressed concern for her safety, asking the detective if her report might provoke retaliation. The police responded by opening a case and referring it to the Commonwealth's attorney. Charges were filed against Kemp, but as of April 2008, the case had not gone to trial. Given the nature of the existing allegations and the timeline, Kemp quickly became the primary person of interest in Megan's murder. Investigators reviewed the case history and found that Megan had been scheduled to testify against him within weeks. The motive appeared clear: silencing a witness in a pending sex crime trial. The circumstances aligned with what police already knew. Megan had been sexually assaulted and killed in her own home during a time when she was alone. On April 12, 2008, 2 days after the murder, police obtained a search warrant for Keith Kemp's residence. During the search, officers confiscated multiple electronic devices, clothing, and items consistent with forensic collection protocols. Kemp was also brought in for questioning. He denied involvement in the murder and provided what he described as an alibi: that he had been at work on the day of Megan's death and had no contact with her since the legal case began. Detectives pressed Kemp for further details. His responses were vague and at times contradictory. He could not recall specific times or activities during the afternoon when the murder occurred. Inconsistencies in his statements raised further suspicion. However, without physical evidence, police could not hold him. A breakthrough came during the forensic review of Kemp's computer, which had been seized during the search. Investigators discovered a collection of illegal media files stored on the device, including multiple images and videos classified as obscene videos. These findings led to separate federal charges, but did not directly tie Kemp to the murder of Megan Landowski. Meanwhile, DNA evidence recovered from the crime scene had been sent to the state laboratory for expedited processing. Analysts had collected a complete DNA profile from semen found on Megan's blanket and clothing. The genetic profile was clean and viable for comparison. Investigators obtained a buccal swab from Kemp, who, under legal obligation, submitted the sample without resistance. On April 18, the lab returned its results. Keith Kemp's DNA did not match the semen collected at the scene. The finding was definitive and legally binding. Despite being under investigation for sexual misconduct involving the victim, Kemp could not be connected to the physical evidence in Megan's murder. Kemp was retained in custody on separate federal charges related to child pornography. However, for Megan's parents, Angela and Chris Short, this was cold comfort. They had believed from the beginning that Kemp was responsible for their daughter's death. His prior behavior and Megan's fear of him seemed to support that conclusion. Forensic teams continued to analyze other trace evidence from the home, including fingerprints, hairs, and fibers. Investigators also re-interviewed family members, neighbors, and classmates. A secondary focus was placed on Megan's social life, including her school relationships and online interactions. Detectives acknowledged that the killer may not have been from her immediate circle, but rather someone who had developed an interest in her through indirect means. With Kemp legally excluded and no viable alternatives, the investigation into the murder of Megan Landowski entered a stalled phase. Internally, the department began restructuring the case approach. Detectives began a systematic re-examination of Megan's life, relationships, and routine in the weeks leading up to the crime. Her classmates from both Portsmouth High School and the Governor's School for the Arts were interviewed. Friends described Megan as outgoing, social, and generally well-liked. She had no known conflicts with peers, and no one could identify any individuals who had threatened her or expressed hostility. Police investigated her romantic history and questioned multiple teenage boys she had dated or interacted with closely. These included former boyfriends and casual acquaintances. All of them submitted DNA samples voluntarily. None of them matched the profile recovered from the crime scene. Detectives also revisited earlier reports that Megan had expressed fear of being alone at home. Some students had claimed she was anxious about something in the days before her death. However, after multiple follow-up interviews, those reports were clarified. Megan's friends explained that she simply preferred to spend time around others, particularly her peers. She had not indicated any specific threats or fears. At this stage, the investigation shifted to Megan's online activity. Her social media accounts, emails, and phone records were reviewed. Investigators hoped to uncover any patterns, unfamiliar contacts, or potentially threatening messages. The digital search produced no suspicious communications or unknown individuals engaging in ongoing conversations with Megan. Her online behavior appeared typical for a teenager. In late summer 2008, the results were returned. The profile suggested that the perpetrator was of African American descent. Though not definitive evidence, the information gave investigators a direction. With the assistance of school administrators and parental consent, police organized a series of voluntary DNA collections from male students in the local area who matched the general description. These included students from both schools Megan attended, as well as teens who lived nearby or were known to have crossed paths with her. Participation from the community was high. Over 100 samples were submitted over the course of several weeks. Every individual tested was cleared. None of the DNA samples matched the profile from the scene. The process, while helpful in eliminating possibilities, failed to identify a suspect. The optimism generated by the biogeographic testing quickly faded. Internally, the police department was under pressure. The case was high profile, involving the daughter of a respected Navy officer and occurring within a family-oriented community, with strong ties to law enforcement and the military. Detectives faced increasing scrutiny from the public, the media, and the victim's family. Angela and Chris Short remained in frequent contact with investigators, providing any information requested and pressing for progress. The emotional weight of the case was evident among the investigative team. Detectives worked extended hours, often revisiting previous leads and reviewing case files for missed details. A full-time task force remained assigned to the case, including personnel from homicide, forensic analysis, and digital investigations. Despite the resources allocated, the investigation stalled. The killer had left behind a strong DNA trail, but remained unidentified. There were no witnesses, no surveillance footage, and no new tips. The evidence collected at the crime scene had been thoroughly processed, and nothing further had emerged from secondary testing. By the end of the year, Megan's murder had entered a cold phase, though it was never officially classified as a cold case. The DNA profile sat in CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System, awaiting a match. Detectives reviewed any new entries into the system, hoping for a hit, but none came. The identity of the person who raped and killed Megan Landowski remained unknown. The lack of progress weighed heavily on everyone involved. For Megan's family, the absence of closure was unbearable. For detectives, it was a daily reminder of a case that had the right evidence, but no name to go with it. The investigative team, led by Detective Robert McDaniel, began a secondary round of interviews and background checks on individuals who had not been previously questioned or tested. One such individual was Robert Barnes, a 17-year-old student who attended the Governor's School for the Arts in Norfolk, where Megan was also enrolled. Barnes was known for being reserved, academically strong, and musically talented. He played violin and was considered by his teachers to be quiet and respectful. He had not previously been flagged in the investigation because he was not part of Megan's known social circle at her home high school in Portsmouth, and there had been no reports of any issues involving him. Barnes was identified during a broad review of students who may have had classes with Megan but had not yet been interviewed or tested. Investigators located him through school records and made initial contact in February 2009. During the conversation, Barnes was cooperative and polite. However, when asked to voluntarily provide a DNA sample, he declined. He stated that his mother would not approve of him participating in the process. At the time, this response stood out. Nearly all of the other students contacted during the investigation had willingly submitted samples, often with parental support. Barnes, who was 17 and legally capable of consenting, was among the very few who refused. His explanation was not confrontational, but it was noted by investigators as an anomaly in an otherwise cooperative pool of subjects. The following day, Barnes recontacted Detective McDaniel and stated that he had reconsidered. He offered a piece of chewing gum as a sample, stating he had just finished chewing it and could submit it in place of a buccal swab. Investigators accepted the gum and sent it to the state forensic lab for analysis. Within days, the lab returned with a finding: The DNA on the gum belonged to a female, not Robert Barnes. Detective McDaniel contacted Barnes for a follow-up interview. During the conversation, Barnes remained calm and appeared unbothered by the test result. He explained that the gum may have been contaminated or mistakenly handled, but denied that he had deliberately misled investigators. He reiterated that he had no involvement in Megan's death. During the interview, however, Barnes made a passing reference to the day of the week on which Megan had been killed. He stated, "That was on a Thursday, right?" This detail had never been publicly released by police or the media. Only investigators and individuals directly involved in the case were aware of the specific day of the week Megan's body had been discovered. This statement immediately changed Barnes's status in the investigation. While not direct evidence of guilt, his knowledge of a non-public case detail placed him under heightened scrutiny. Investigators began reviewing his background more thoroughly. He was not previously known to have had a close relationship with Megan, but they had attended classes in the same building at the governor's school. Witnesses confirmed they had spoken on occasion, but there were no known conflicts or connections of concern. Barnes had no criminal history. His academic record was clean, and there were no reports of behavioral issues. Teachers described him as introverted and disciplined, while peers recalled that he kept mostly to himself. However, several classmates did note that Barnes had shown a particular interest in Megan, often watching her at lunch or attempting to start conversations that she seemed to avoid. These behaviors had not been previously reported, but they added context to his presence in the investigation. With Barnes now under active suspicion, investigators began working to obtain a proper DNA sample. Because he had already offered one sample voluntarily, they required either his cooperation or a court order to collect another. While pursuing legal avenues, they also monitored his behavior, school attendance, and potential efforts to avoid further contact with police. Barnes did not resist future communication. He met with detectives a second time and, after some discussion, agreed to submit a new DNA sample through an official cheek swab procedure. The sample was collected, labeled, and delivered to the forensic lab for comparison. At this point in the investigation, Barnes was not under arrest, and no charges had been filed. However, the combination of his unusual DNA submission, specific case knowledge, and subtle behavioral patterns placed him at the center of the case for the first time. Investigators made no public statements about the shift in focus, but began treating Barnes as the primary subject in their ongoing efforts. When the lab results returned in early March 2009, they confirmed what investigators had begun to suspect. The DNA collected from Robert Barnes matched the profile obtained from the semen found on Megan Landowski's bedding and clothing. After nearly a year of uncertainty, law enforcement had a direct forensic link between the victim and a suspect. With this confirmation, detectives brought Barnes in for another round of questioning. He was informed of the DNA match and advised of his rights. Unlike previous interviews, this session was conducted with heightened formality. Forensic evidence now placed him at the scene during the time of the crime, and investigators were prepared for either a confession or further deception. Barnes did not initially deny the DNA results. Instead, he began providing what he claimed was the full story. According to his account, Megan had invited him to her home on the afternoon of April 10, 2008. He alleged that upon arriving, he found her already inside, and that they were not alone. Barnes stated that a man wearing a ski mask and armed with a handgun was already in the house, holding Megan at gunpoint. He claimed that the masked man ordered him to restrain Megan using tape that was already available. Barnes said he complied out of fear. According to his version, the armed man threatened to kill him if he did not follow instructions. He further alleged that the man demanded he engage in acts with Megan. Barnes stated that he did so under duress, believing his life was at risk. He then described watching the masked man retrieve a knife from the kitchen and begin stabbing Megan repeatedly. Barnes said he was frozen in fear, but attempted to intervene, at which point the attacker allegedly cut his finger before fleeing the home. He explained that this injury explained why his DNA was present on the scene. The statement, while dramatic and emotionally charged, did not align with the evidence collected during the investigation. Detectives carefully documented Barnes's confession and began cross-referencing it with known facts. The most immediate problem was the complete lack of any physical or forensic evidence supporting the presence of a second person in the house. No fingerprints, hair, shoe prints, or other indicators suggested a third party had entered the residence. The entry point, the ground floor window, was consistent with a single intruder. There was no surveillance footage, neighborhood sightings, or witness statements suggesting someone else had been in the area. Secondly, Barnes's injury, a small cut on his finger, was not documented at the time of the crime. No medical records, bandages, or reports supported his claim of being wounded during the event. Investigators also noted that he had never mentioned this injury during earlier interviews. The cut, if it had occurred at all, could not be definitively linked to the time or location of the crime. The evidence indicated no signs of a struggle or coercion between Barnes and Megan beyond the initial restraints. Investigators noted that Megan had been bound with packing tape found in the home, suggesting that the person who applied it was familiar with the environment or had taken time to locate materials after entry. There was no sign of a weapon at the scene that could be linked to an unknown assailant. The knife used in the stabbing was taken from the family's kitchen. Detectives also reviewed Barnes's past statements. His earlier refusal to submit DNA, the use of gum laced with another person's DNA, and his knowledge of the exact day of the murder were all viewed as deceptive behavior. Investigators concluded that Robert Barnes had entered the home by way of the ground floor window, likely knowing that Megan would be alone. The wounds to her neck and back, some of which were post-mortem, suggested overkill and a deeply personal motive. The theory that Barnes had developed an unhealthy fixation on Megan and reacted violently to perceived rejection or resistance became the prevailing narrative. On March 12, 2009, after consulting with prosecutors and reviewing all available evidence, the Portsmouth Police Department formally arrested Robert Barnes. He was charged with first-degree murder, aggravated assault, and use of a deadly weapon in the commission of a felony. Barnes was taken into custody without incident and held without bond. Following his March 2009 arrest, Robert Barnes was held in pre-trial detention at the Portsmouth City Jail. Prosecutors moved quickly to build the formal case against him. The key evidence was already in place: a DNA match confirming his presence at the scene, Megan Landowski's physical injuries consistent with rape and overkill, and a confession containing both incriminating details and provably false statements. From a legal standpoint, the case was strong. In the months that followed, Barnes underwent multiple psychological evaluations. Defense attorneys hinted that mental illness or emotional instability could be factors in the case. However, none of the evaluations concluded that he was incompetent to stand trial. He was deemed legally sane, aware of his actions, and capable of understanding the nature of the charges against him. Prosecutors prepared to pursue a first-degree murder charge with aggravating factors, including rape and the use of a deadly weapon. The charges carried the potential for multiple life sentences. Megan's family attended all key proceedings and remained in close contact with the Commonwealth's Attorney's Office throughout. Despite the strength of the prosecution's case, Barnes unexpectedly pleaded guilty to all charges in September 2009. There was no trial, no jury selection, and no formal cross-examination of evidence. In a closed courtroom hearing, he admitted the murder of Megan Landowski. The court accepted the plea and sentenced him to 2 consecutive life terms, without the possibility of parole. The decision to plead guilty shocked the public. It also left the most haunting question unresolved. Why? Robert Barnes never offered an explanation beyond the fictional account involving a masked intruder. He did not provide a motive, nor did he express remorse during the sentencing hearing. When asked if he had anything to say before sentencing, he declined to speak. No apology was given. No further testimony was offered. For the Landowski family, the plea provided legal closure, but no emotional resolution. The man who had taken their daughter's life had been removed from society, but he had not explained his actions, and he had not acknowledged the pain he caused. Megan's mother, Angela, later stated in an interview that while she was relieved the case had concluded, "There's no justice that brings her back." Investigators and prosecutors maintained the theory that the crime was motivated by obsession, rejection, and rage. Classmates had previously noted Barnes's subtle attempts to get close to Megan and his visible frustration when she did not reciprocate. Though these behaviors had seemed harmless at the time, In retrospect, they pointed to an unhealthy fixation. Detectives believed that Megan, who was friendly and socially active, likely never recognized any threat from Barnes, who kept to himself and gave no outward signs of violent intent. The level of violence inflicted during the murder suggested a level of personal fury inconsistent with random or opportunistic crime. Megan had been stabbed over 40 times, including post-mortem wounds, acts associated with emotional overdrive. The use of household items as weapons and restraints further suggested that Barnes had not brought tools with him, but instead made decisions impulsively inside the home once he had gained entry. Though the crime had been solved, it left lasting damage. At Portsmouth High School and the Governor's School for the Arts, counseling services were extended for students and faculty. Robert Barnes, a teenager with no criminal record, no documented psychological disorder, and no prior conflict with law enforcement, had committed one of the most brutal murders in Portsmouth's history.